the man who changed how we see ourselves. Picture a therapy room in 1940s America. A psychologist sits across from his client, but something is different here. There is no notepad filled with clinical observations, no air of superiority, no rush to diagnose. Instead, there is simply one human being, fully present, listening to another. This was Carl Rogers, and he was about to revolutionize our understanding of what it means to become truly conscious. Born in Oak Park, Illinois, in 1902, Rogers grew up in a strict religious household where feelings were rarely discussed and conformity was expected. His early years were marked by isolation and rigid rules. Yet this very environment planted the seeds of his life's work. He would eventually question everything he had been taught about human nature, about therapy, and about what it means to grow psychologically. By the 1950s, Rogers had emerged as a founding figure of humanistic psychology. He stood in stark contrast to the prevailing theories of his time. Freud saw humans as driven by unconscious sexual and aggressive instincts. Behaviorists like Skinner viewed people as products of conditioning, shaped entirely by their environment. But Rogers proposed something radically different. He believed that within each person exists an innate tendency toward growth, toward becoming more fully human. He called this the actualizing tendency. His person-centered therapy became revolutionary not for what the therapist did, but for what they didn't do. Rogers stripped away the expert facade. He didn't interpret dreams or analyze unconscious conflicts. He didn't prescribe behaviors or offer solutions. Instead, he created conditions where individuals could discover their own truth. Through unconditional positive regard, genuine empathy, and authentic presence, Rogers witnessed something profound. When people felt truly heard and accepted, they began to awaken to themselves. But here is what Rogers noticed as he sat with hundreds of clients over decades of practice: awakening is not purely liberating. There is a cost to consciousness that he rarely emphasized in his more optimistic writings. When someone truly wakes up to who they are, to the reality of their experience, to the incongruence they have been living with, they lose something. And they can never get it back. This is not the story you typically hear about personal growth. This is about what Rogers observed but perhaps never fully articulated: the irreversible losses that come with psychological awakening. The loss of comfortable illusions. Rogers spoke often about congruence, the alignment between one's inner experience and one's self-concept. But to achieve congruence, one must first become aware of the incongruence. And this awareness shatters something precious: the illusions that have protected us. Consider a woman named Sarah, living in suburban London in the early 1960s. She has built her entire identity around being the perfect wife and mother. She wears the right clothes, says the right things, hosts dinner parties with practiced grace. On the surface, everything appears ideal. But in Rogers' therapy room, something shifts. As she experiences unconditional positive regard, as she is given permission to explore her actual feelings without judgment, a terrifying awareness emerges. She realizes she has been performing for years. The cheerful persona is a mask. Beneath it lies exhaustion, resentment, and a longing for something she cannot yet name. This is the first loss of awakening, the loss of comfortable illusions about oneself. Rogers called this the phenomenal field, the totality of one's experience at any given moment. Before awakening, much of this field remains outside conscious awareness. We develop what Rogers termed the ideal self, a construction based not on our authentic experience but on conditions of worth imposed by others. Our parents, our society, our culture tell us who we should be. And to receive love and acceptance, we contort ourselves to fit that mold. The awakened person loses the ability to maintain this split. Once Sarah recognizes that her cheerful facade is just that, a facade, she cannot unknow it. The illusion has been shattered. She cannot go back to unconsciously performing the role. Every time she hosts a dinner party now, she is aware of the performance. The ease is gone. The automaticity has vanished. This is not simply about becoming more honest. It is about losing the protective buffer that illusions provide. When you believe your own performance, there is a certain peace in it. The cognitive dissonance is minimized because you are not fully conscious of it. But awakening brings that dissonance into sharp, unavoidable focus. Rogers observed this pattern repeatedly. Clients who entered therapy seeking to become better versions of their ideal selves often discovered instead that they needed to dismantle that ideal entirely. The ideal self, Rogers recognized, is often a tyrannical construct. It demands perfection, denies authentic feelings, and perpetuates incongruence. But it also offers something, the illusion of control, the comfort of knowing exactly who you are supposed to be. The awakened person loses this comfort. They lose the certainty of a fixed identity. They lose the ease of unconscious conformity. And they discover something unsettling: they have been living someone else's life, pursuing someone else's values, and wearing someone else's face. In 1950s and 60s Britain, this awakening was particularly jarring. The post-war era emphasized stability, traditional roles, and social conformity. To wake up and realize you had been suppressing your true self for decades, this was not just personally disruptive, it was socially dangerous. Yet Rogers' work spread because people were quietly suffering in their illusions. The awakening was painful, but the alternative, remaining asleep, had become unbearable. Once the illusion cracks, it cannot be repaired. You cannot unsee what you have seen. You cannot unknow what you have come to know about yourself. This is the first irreversible loss of awakening. The loss of innocence about human nature. Rogers held a fundamentally optimistic view of human nature. He believed that people, when provided with the right conditions, naturally move toward growth, toward actualization, toward becoming more fully themselves. His theory rested on the idea that the core of human nature is essentially positive, essentially trustworthy. But here is the paradox: awakening to one's own experience also means awakening to the reality of human behavior, including one's own capacity for self-deception, rationalization, and harm. Consider what Rogers himself witnessed in his practice. He saw people who had hurt others, who had abandoned children, who had lied and manipulated. He saw the ways people distorted reality to maintain their self-concept. He saw individuals who, when their defenses failed completely, descended into psychological fragmentation. Rogers called this state one where the defenses cease to function altogether and the individual becomes aware of the incongruity of their situation. Their personality becomes disorganized and bizarre. The awakened person loses a certain innocence about human nature. They lose the naive belief that people are simply good or bad. They discover instead that humans are complex, contradictory beings capable of both extraordinary compassion and stunning cruelty, often within the same individual. This loss extends to one's view of oneself. Before awakening, we can maintain a simplified self-narrative. We are the hero of our own story, our intentions are good, our actions justified. But true self-awareness, the kind Rogers facilitated through his therapeutic conditions, reveals something more complicated. You become aware of the times you have been inauthentic, not out of malice but out of fear. You recognize how you have hurt people while believing you were helping them. You see the ways you have manipulated situations to protect your self-concept. You discover that you are capable of the very behaviors you have judged harshly in others. This is not the same as self-loathing. Rogers was clear that self-acceptance must accompany self-awareness. But it does require a loss of innocence. The awakened person cannot maintain the illusion of moral purity. They cannot divide the world neatly into good people and bad people because they have seen the complexity within themselves. In Rogers' framework, this awareness should lead to greater compassion, both for oneself and for others. When you recognize your own capacity for incongruence, for self-deception, for causing harm despite good intentions, you become less judgmental of others. You develop what Rogers called organismic trusting, a trust in your actual experience rather than in rigid moral categories. But this loss of innocence is still a loss. There is something comforting about believing in clear moral categories, about seeing oneself as fundamentally good and certain others as fundamentally bad. The awakened person loses this comfort. They lose the ability to feel morally superior. They lose the self-righteousness that can feel so satisfying. Moreover, they lose innocence about the therapeutic process itself. Rogers witnessed how awareness could be destabilizing. He saw clients whose defenses, once dismantled, left them vulnerable and disorganized. The journey toward congruence is not always linear or safe. Sometimes awareness brings pain that feels unbearable. The awakened person knows this. They know that growth is not always pleasant, that authenticity can be lonely, that becoming more conscious means confronting aspects of reality that are deeply uncomfortable. They lose the innocent belief that self-awareness is purely beneficial, that personal growth is always empowering. This loss marks a transition from psychological childhood to psychological maturity. But like all maturations, it comes at a cost. The simplicity is gone. The world becomes more ambiguous, more nuanced, more uncertain. The loss of unconscious belonging. Rogers emphasized the importance of unconditional positive regard, the experience of being accepted fully without conditions. But what he observed, though perhaps did not emphasize enough, is what happens when someone has been living under conditions of worth their entire life and suddenly becomes aware of it. Conditions of worth are the messages we internalize about what we must do, be, or achieve to be worthy of love. They are the implicit rules: be successful, be agreeable, be attractive, be intelligent, be strong, be independent. These conditions shape our self-concept from early childhood. We learn what behaviors earn approval and which ones lead to rejection. And most powerfully, we internalize these conditions so deeply that we forget they are conditions at all. They simply become who we are. But then something shifts. Through therapy, through life experiences, through a moment of clarity, we become conscious of these conditions. We realize that our entire personality has been constructed to meet someone else's expectations. And with this realization comes a profound loss, the loss of unconscious belonging. Before awakening, there is an ease in conformity. When you unconsciously meet the conditions of worth set by your family, your community, your culture, you belong without effort. You fit in naturally because you have internalized the very criteria for belonging. There is no internal conflict because there is no awareness of the price you are paying. But once awakened, that ease vanishes. You become aware that your belonging has been conditional all along. You have been accepted not for who you truly are, but for who you have managed to appear to be. This awareness creates an unbridgeable distance between you and those who still live within the conditions. Consider a young man in 1960s Britain who has been raised to be proper, to pursue a respectable career, to marry appropriately, to never question authority. As long as he remains unconscious, he can fulfill these expectations without internal conflict. He belongs to his family, his social class, his culture. But if he awakens, if he begins to question whether these expectations align with his authentic experience, something irreversible happens. He loses the ability to belong unconsciously. Even if he chooses to continue fulfilling the external expectations, he is now aware that he is choosing. The automatic, effortless quality of belonging is gone. There is now a self-consciousness, a distance, an awareness of the performance. Rogers spoke about this indirectly when he described the fully functioning person as someone who trusts their organismic experience over external authorities. But he may have underestimated how profoundly isolating this shift can be. When you stop deriving your sense of self from external validation, when you begin trusting your own experience as the highest authority, you step outside the familiar systems of belonging. This is particularly acute in collectivist contexts or tightly knit communities where group cohesion depends on shared, unquestioned values. The awakened person becomes a kind of outsider even while remaining physically present. They see the mechanisms of social control that others experience as natural. They recognize the ways conformity is enforced through subtle approvals and disapprovals. And they can no longer participate in these dynamics with innocence. The loss extends to intimate relationships as well. When you become aware that someone's love for you has always been conditional, contingent on you being a certain way, doing certain things, suppressing certain aspects of yourself, the relationship fundamentally changes. You cannot unknow this. You cannot return to the unconscious acceptance of conditional love as if it were unconditional. Rogers believed that human beings thrive in environments of genuine acceptance. But he also recognized that such environments are rare. Most of us grow up in contexts where love and approval come with conditions attached. The awakened person loses the ability to pretend otherwise. They lose the comfort of believing they are truly accepted while still conforming to conditions of worth. This loss creates a painful dilemma. Do you continue to fulfill the conditions and maintain belonging while knowing it is inauthentic? Or do you honor your authentic experience and risk rejection? There is no easy answer. But the awakened person has lost the option of not choosing. Consciousness has made the choice unavoidable. The loneliness of awakening is real. Rogers surrounded himself with communities of fellow psychologists and clients who understood this journey. But for many who awaken, there is a period of profound isolation. You no longer fit comfortably in the world you once knew, but you have not yet found a new community that can embrace your authenticity. This is the loss of unconscious belonging, the comfortable, unquestioned sense of being part of something larger than yourself. Once you see the conditions, you can never unsee them. Once you recognize the cost of belonging, you can never pay it unconsciously again. The loss of defensive strategies. Rogers' theory included a sophisticated understanding of psychological defenses. He recognized that people develop elaborate strategies to protect their self-concept when experience threatens to contradict it. We distort reality, we deny uncomfortable feelings, we rationalize behaviors that conflict with our self-image. These defenses are not arbitrary, they serve a crucial function. They maintain psychological coherence when experience and self-concept are incongruent. But here is what happens when someone awakens: their defenses begin to fail. Not because they choose to abandon them, but because awareness makes them increasingly ineffective. Consider the defense of rationalization. Before awakening, you might mistreat someone and immediately construct a justification: they deserved it, they misunderstood, they were too sensitive. The rationalization works because it is automatic and unconscious. It protects your self-concept as a good person while allowing you to engage in behavior that contradicts that concept. But as you become more conscious, as you develop what Rogers called an openness to experience, rationalization becomes harder to sustain. You become aware that you are rationalizing. You catch yourself constructing the justification even as you speak it. And once you are aware, the defense loses its protective power. You can no longer convince yourself with your own rationalizations. The same applies to denial, projection, and other defensive strategies. Awakening brings them into consciousness, and consciousness undermines their function. It is like becoming aware of a magic trick while it is happening. Once you see the mechanism, it no longer works on you. Rogers described this process when he spoke about individuals whose defenses cease to function altogether. He noted that this could lead to temporary disorganization, to psychological vulnerability, to states of confusion and distress. The defenses were not merely obstacles to growth, they were also the scaffolding holding a fragile self-concept together. When they fall away, there can be a period of chaos before a new, more integrated self-structure emerges. The awakened person loses the protection that defenses provided. They lose the ability to hide from painful truths about themselves. They lose the comfort of self-deception. And this loss can be genuinely dangerous. Rogers recognized that not everyone is ready for this level of awareness at any given moment. The defenses exist for a reason. They protect psychological survival when the truth feels unbearable. This is why Rogers emphasized the therapeutic condition so strongly. Unconditional positive regard, empathy, and genuineness create a safe container where defenses can be gradually relaxed without total collapse. But even in the best therapeutic relationship, the loss of defenses is destabilizing. In everyday life, outside the therapy room, this loss can be profoundly disorienting. You become aware of your own emotional reactions in real time. You notice when you are being defensive, when you are avoiding something, when you are projecting onto others. This awareness can be paralyzing. The automatic responses that once protected you no longer operate smoothly. You become self-conscious in ways that interfere with spontaneous living. Moreover, you become aware of others' defenses. You see when people are rationalizing, when they are in denial, when they are protecting their self-concept at all costs. And you can no longer pretend you do not see it. This creates a kind of loneliness, a sense of living in a different reality than those around you. Rogers believed that as defenses fall away, they are replaced by something healthier, organismic valuing, the ability to trust one's actual experience rather than distorted perceptions. But the transition period is difficult. There is a gap between losing old defenses and developing genuine self-trust. In that gap, the awakened person is vulnerable in ways they have never been before. They lose the psychological armor that made daily life manageable. They lose the ability to function on autopilot, to move through social situations with practiced ease, to protect themselves from emotional pain through unconscious mechanisms. Everything becomes more immediate, more raw, more present. This is the loss of defensive strategies, the loss of the automatic protections that shield us from painful awareness. Rogers believed this loss was necessary for genuine growth. But it is still a loss, and the awakened person feels it acutely. They cannot return to unconscious defense because they are now conscious of the mechanisms. The innocence of automatic protection is gone forever. The loss of simple answers. One of Rogers' most enduring contributions was his emphasis on the client as the expert on their own experience. He rejected the model of the therapist as authority figure who diagnoses and prescribes solutions. Instead, he trusted that individuals, given the right conditions, could find their own answers. But what Rogers observed, and what many who go through awakening discover, is that becoming the expert on your own experience means losing the comfort of external authorities providing simple answers. Before awakening, life can feel more manageable because you can defer to experts, traditions, social norms, or authority figures for guidance. There is a clear right and wrong, a prescribed path, a set of rules to follow. If you are unsure what to do, you can look outside yourself for the answer. This external locus of evaluation, as Rogers called it, has significant drawbacks. It leads to incongruence and inauthenticity, but it also provides structure and certainty. The awakened person develops an internal locus of evaluation. They learn to trust their own organismic experience as the primary guide for decision-making. But this shift brings a profound loss, the loss of simple answers. When you trust your own experience, everything becomes more complex. There are no easy formulas, no universal rules that apply to every situation. What feels right for you may not be what others expect. What aligns with your authentic experience may contradict conventional wisdom. You lose the certainty that comes from following established paths. Consider the question of how to live a meaningful life. Before awakening, you might have clear answers provided by your religion, your culture, your family traditions. Work hard, marry well, raise children, contribute to society. The path is laid out. You may struggle to follow it, but at least you know what you are supposed to do. But the awakened person, trusting their organismic experience, may find that none of these prescribed paths feel authentic. The marriage expected by family feels suffocating. The career valued by society feels meaningless. The traditional markers of success feel empty. And now what? There is no blueprint for creating a life that honors your unique, subjective experience. You must figure it out yourself, moment by moment, with no guarantee that you are making the right choices. Rogers spoke about this when he described fully functioning individuals as living existentially, being fully present in each moment rather than following rigid plans or expectations. But existential living is demanding. It requires constant attentiveness to your own experience. It requires the courage to make choices without certainty. It requires accepting that there are no simple answers, no formulas, no shortcuts. The loss extends to moral and ethical questions. Before awakening, you might have clear moral guidelines provided by your religious tradition or cultural values. But the awakened person, encountering moral complexity in their own experience, discovers that real situations rarely fit neatly into predetermined categories. Context matters. Nuance matters. The simple answer, always tell the truth, always be selfless, always follow the rules, proves inadequate when confronted with the messiness of actual life. This does not mean the awakened person becomes immoral or nihilistic. Rogers believed that organismic valuing, when trusted, leads toward constructive, pro-social choices. But it does mean that the certainty of simple moral rules is gone. Every situation requires fresh discernment. Every choice requires consulting one's actual experience rather than defaulting to external authority. The loss of simple answers creates anxiety. Without clear guidelines, how do you know if you are making the right choices? How do you know if you are living well? Rogers would say that you know through organismic experience, through the felt sense of congruence and authenticity. But this is subtle and uncertain compared to the clarity of external rules. Moreover, the awakened person loses the ability to justify their choices by appealing to authority. They cannot say, "I did this because the Bible says so," or "I chose this because society expects it," or "I followed the rules." They must own their choices fully, acknowledging that they are acting from their own judgment, their own values, their own experience. This level of responsibility can feel overwhelming. In Rogers' therapeutic work in 1950s and 60s Britain, this loss was particularly significant. British culture of that era emphasized tradition, propriety, and clear social hierarchies. To question these structures, to develop an internal locus of evaluation, was to step outside the safety of conventional wisdom. Many of Rogers' clients experienced profound disorientation as they lost faith in external authorities and had not yet developed full trust in their own organismic valuing. The awakened person discovers that consciousness does not provide clarity, it provides complexity. They lose the comfort of simple answers and gain the burden of authentic choice. They can never return to the innocence of unquestioned obedience or conventional living. The loss is irreversible. The loss of future selves. Rogers' concept of the ideal self is central to understanding what awakening costs us. The ideal self is not the real self, it is a constructed image of who we think we should become, shaped by the conditions of worth we have internalized. For most people, the ideal self represents hope. It is the person you will be once you finally achieve enough, improve enough, become enough. But here is what Rogers observed: true awakening requires relinquishing the ideal self. And with it goes a particular kind of hope that many people have structured their entire lives around. Before awakening, the ideal self functions as a motivating force. You imagine a future version of yourself, more confident, more successful, more lovable, more complete. This imagined future self gives your present struggles meaning. You endure difficulties now because you believe they are moving you toward becoming that ideal person. The gap between your real self and ideal self creates tension, but it also creates direction. Rogers recognized that this gap often produces psychological distress. The ideal self is typically unattainable because it is based not on your actual potentials but on internalized conditions of worth. You are trying to become someone that society, or your parents, or your culture thinks you should be. The ideal self is, as Rogers put it, something not real, something always out of reach, a standard people cannot meet. Awakening brings a painful realization: the ideal self is an illusion. It is not who you will become through effort and discipline. It is a fantasy constructed to meet conditions of worth that may have nothing to do with your authentic nature. And once you see this, you must let it go. This is a profound loss. The ideal self may have been your North Star for decades. It may have given your life purpose and direction. You may have made enormous sacrifices in pursuit of becoming that idealized version of yourself. And now, through the process of awakening, you recognize that you have been chasing something that was never truly you. Consider someone who has spent 30 years trying to become the successful entrepreneur their father wanted them to be. The ideal self in this case is shaped by the father's values, the father's dreams, the father's disappointed hopes. Through therapy with a Rogerian practitioner, this person begins to realize that they do not actually care about business success. Their organismic experience points toward something entirely different, perhaps teaching, perhaps art, perhaps a simple life focused on relationships rather than achievement. This realization is liberating in one sense. It frees them from the exhausting pursuit of an inauthentic goal. But it is also devastating. They must grieve the loss of the future self they imagined. They must accept that 30 years of their life were spent pursuing someone else's dream. They must face the reality that the person they thought they were becoming will never exist. Rogers believed that relinquishing the ideal self allows the real self to emerge and actualize. But he perhaps underestimated how attached people become to their ideal selves, even when those selves are inauthentic. The ideal self provides hope, structure, and meaning. Losing it can feel like losing your future. Moreover, awakening reveals that there is no fixed endpoint to reach. Rogers described the fully functioning person as someone who embraces being a process rather than a product. One of his clients expressed it beautifully: "I haven't finished the job of integrating and reorganizing myself, but that's only confusing, not discouraging, now that I realize this is a continuing process." This shift from product to process is philosophically appealing, but it represents another loss, the loss of arrival. Before awakening, you imagine that once you become your ideal self, you will have arrived. The struggle will be over. You will finally be complete, fixed, finished. But awakening reveals that there is no arrival point. You are always becoming, always changing, always in process. For some, this is liberating. For others, it is exhausting. The awakened person loses the hope of ever being finished, ever being complete, ever reaching a point where they can stop growing and simply be. The process is endless. The journey never concludes. This loss is particularly acute in cultures that emphasize achievement and completion. The awakened person must create meaning in the process itself rather than in reaching a destination. They must find satisfaction in the ongoing work of becoming rather than in achieving a final form. They must accept that they will never be the person they once imagined becoming, because that person was never real to begin with. This requires grieving multiple lost futures: the future where you become the ideal self you have been pursuing, the future where you finally arrive and are complete, the future where all the struggle makes sense because you have reached the destination. All of these futures must be relinquished. The awakened person lives instead in an open-ended present, trusting the actualizing tendency without knowing exactly where it will lead. It is a loss of narrative certainty. Before awakening, your life story has a clear arc: you are moving from your current flawed self toward your ideal completed self. But after awakening, the narrative becomes less clear. You are simply becoming more fully yourself, whatever that means. The story no longer has a predetermined ending. The loss of the ideal self and the fantasy of arrival cannot be recovered. Once you recognize that you are a process rather than a product, you cannot return to imagining a fixed future self. The awakened person must live with this uncertainty forever. The paradox of liberation and loss. We have explored the losses that accompany awakening, the comfortable illusions about oneself, the innocence about human nature, the ease of unconscious belonging, the protection of defensive strategies, the certainty of simple answers, and the hope invested in an ideal future self. Each of these losses is irreversible. Once awakened, you cannot unknow what you have come to know. But Rogers' work points toward a profound paradox: these losses are also liberations. When you lose comfortable illusions about yourself, you gain authentic self-knowledge. When you lose innocence about human nature, you gain compassion and realistic understanding. When you lose unconscious belonging, you create the possibility of genuine connection based on authenticity rather than conformity. When you lose defensive strategies, you become open to the fullness of experience. When you lose simple answers, you develop the capacity for nuanced, contextual wisdom. When you lose the ideal self, you free your real self to actualize. Rogers believed deeply in the actualizing tendency, the inherent drive within every organism toward growth and fulfillment. He observed that when the conditions are right, when there is unconditional positive regard, empathy, and genuineness, people naturally move toward greater congruence, greater authenticity, greater aliveness. But the movement toward actualization requires relinquishing what came before. You cannot become more fully yourself while clinging to who you thought you should be. You cannot achieve congruence while maintaining the incongruent structures that feel safe and familiar. Awakening demands that you let go. This is why Rogers emphasized process over product. The fully functioning person, in his view, is not someone who has achieved a perfect state. Rather, they are someone who is continually engaged in becoming more open to experience, more trusting of their organismic valuing, more willing to live existentially in each moment. Rogers described several characteristics of fully functioning people that illuminate what is gained through the losses we have discussed. They develop an openness to experience, no longer needing to defend against aspects of reality that contradict their self-concept. They learn to live existentially, being fully present in each moment rather than being controlled by the past or anxious about the future. They develop organismic trusting, a confidence in their own experience as a guide for decision-making. These gains are real and profound. But they do not erase the losses. The awakened person lives with both simultaneously, the liberation of authenticity and the grief of what had to be relinquished to achieve it. In his later years, Rogers himself experienced this paradox acutely. He became more emotionally expressive, more vulnerable, more willing to take risks in relationships. He described feeling emotions more intensely, both positive and negative. Hurt seems sharper, pain is more intense, tears come more easily, joy reaches higher peaks, he wrote. The defensive numbing was gone, replaced by full-spectrum feeling. This was both gift and burden. Rogers also witnessed this paradox in his clients and in the encounter groups he facilitated. People who awakened through therapy often reported feeling simultaneously more alive and more vulnerable, more free and more uncertain, more authentic and more alone. The process of becoming more fully oneself is not comfortable or safe. It is necessary, but it costs something. There is no going back. This is perhaps the most important point to understand about awakening in Rogers' framework. Once you have become conscious, once you have experienced congruence, once you have tasted authentic living, you cannot voluntarily return to unconsciousness. The losses are permanent. You can, of course, choose inauthenticity after awakening. You can consciously suppress your real feelings, conform to others' expectations, and live incongruently. But it is different now. Before awakening, the inauthenticity was unconscious and therefore easier to sustain. After awakening, any return to inauthenticity is conscious, and the inner conflict becomes unbearable. This is what Rogers meant when he spoke about people who, once they have glimpsed greater congruence, find it impossible to return to their old patterns. The awareness has changed them irreversibly. They have lost the ability to live unconsciously. In contemporary Britain and around the world, Rogers' insights remain profoundly relevant. We live in a culture that often emphasizes superficial markers of success over authentic living. We are bombarded with ideal selves constructed by social media, advertising, and social pressure. The conditions of worth are more pervasive than ever. And yet, the impulse toward awakening persists. People continue to seek therapy, to question their lives, to wonder if there is something more authentic available to them. They sense the incongruence, even if they do not have Rogers' language to describe it. For those who choose the path of awakening, it is essential to understand what you are choosing. You are not simply gaining self-awareness or personal growth. You are also losing something that cannot be recovered. You are trading the comfort of unconsciousness for the demanding work of authentic living. You are accepting that life will become more complex, more nuanced, more uncertain. Rogers believed this trade was worthwhile. He devoted his entire career to creating conditions where people could awaken safely, where the losses could be grieved within a container of unconditional positive regard, where the liberation could be experienced even as the costs were acknowledged. But he also knew that awakening is not for everyone at every moment. Some people need their defenses. Some people are not ready to relinquish their ideal selves. Some people cannot yet afford the loneliness that comes with stepping outside conventional belonging. And that is acceptable. The actualizing tendency does not operate on a timeline. It unfolds when conditions allow. For those who do awaken, who do lose what cannot be recovered, Rogers offers this: trust the process.